Sean Diddy Combs isn't just fighting for his freedom, he's fighting to hold on to his fortune. Forbes now estimates his net worth is $400 million, a significant drop from the $740 million valuation just a few years ago. But that number could shrink even more. Federal prosecutors are moving to seize assets tied to the alleged criminal activity.
Buckle up, guys, because this is where the case quietly transforms into something far more dangerous than a standard legal fight. From an outside perspective, what began as a question of guilt slowly reorients itself around survival the moment finances enter the frame. Money doesn't just complicate the narrative, it reframes it entirely. Observers notice the tone shift instantly. The language becomes colder, more precise, almost clinical. This is no longer about dramatic testimony or emotional defenses. It's about exposure. What once looked like an untouchable empire now appears vulnerable under scrutiny, not through scandal but through calculation. Every dollar becomes a data point. Every transaction becomes a question. Analysts watching closely recognize this as the moment power starts getting translated into paperwork. Audits replace intimidation. Ledgers replace loyalty. And the real danger isn't a single charge, it's the slow dismantling of the structure that sustained influence. From the outside, it becomes clear that freedom is only one battlefield. Reputation, leverage, and long-term control are now equally at stake. This is the moment observers realize the case isn't trying to make noise. It's trying to make history, quietly, methodically, and permanently.
Once considered a billionaire with a vodka line, a TV network, and a clothing brand, Sean Combs' fortune has taken a major hit. Forbes estimates his net worth is roughly $400 million, nearly half of what it was just a few years ago. Both his Beverly Hills and Miami mansions were raided in March of 2024 as part of the investigation into his alleged crimes. And that number may continue to drop as Combs faces a federal trial and a Justice Department forfeiture action that could cost him his empire. An empire that prosecutors allege was built, at least in part, through a pattern of criminal activity, including alleged sex trafficking, drug distribution, and violence, all used to advance what they call a racketeering enterprise. In the unsealed indictment, prosecutors outline how his business and personal assets allegedly played a role in carrying out or concealing the crimes. This means any assets connected to the behavior, even indirectly, could be seized, including real estate, companies, vehicles, and aircrafts. Now, his $60 million private jet has reportedly already been sold. The Beverly Hills estate is currently on the market for $61 million. And while Combs still owns his $48 million Miami mansion, a judge denied his request to use it as collateral for bond. In week 2 of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon took the stand. Gannon, who helped lead the March raids of Combs' homes, walked jurors through photos of the items seized. Among them, parts of AR-15 style rifles with the serial number scratched off, loaded magazines, a Gucci bag reportedly filled with ketamine and MDMA, and personal items like lingerie and dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors say this evidence is critical to establishing the elements required under federal racketeering laws, helping them show a pattern of alleged crime, criminal behavior used to sustain or conceal the enterprise. In an effort to protect what's left of his assets, Combs hired Stefan Casella, former deputy chief of the Justice Department's asset forfeiture and money laundering section, to fight the forfeiture action. If the jury finds Combs guilty, it will be up to them to determine how much of Combs' assets are subject to forfeiture. Anything forfeited after a conviction could be used to support alleged victims. Sean Combs denies all allegations. And to help us break down what's at stake, I'm joined by Jim Trusty. He's the former chief of the Department of Justice, Organized Crime and Gang Section. Jim, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Good to be here.
So, Jim, let's start with the forfeiture. This isn't just about prison time anymore. Prosecutors want his empire. From what you've seen in the filings, how aggressive is this?
Well, it looks to be very aggressive, and there's a couple of reasons I say that. The first is it's very broadly worded. What they're talking about is essentially any property, real or personal, that could constitute either facilitating property or instrumentalities, they call it, or proceeds. And so that's kind of the whole business empire of P. Diddy being at risk. And that's the second part, which is it's a RICO case, a criminal enterprise case, where they've defined the organization, the criminal enterprise, as not just Sean Combs, but as all these business interests that he has, including liquor labels, music labels, everything else you can think of. So they've set it up in a way where when they get to a forfeiture phase, if there's...
All right, guys, this is where the financial reality stops being abstract and starts leaving visible cracks. From a third-person lens, the reported drop in net worth isn't symbolic posturing, it's structural damage. Analysts don't read this as coincidence. They read it as consequence. Assets that once projected permanence now appear fragile under pressure. Properties that signaled dominance suddenly feel provisional. Jets that symbolized freedom now symbolize liability. Observers notice a critical shift here: movement slows. Transactions stall. Requests require approval. What once flowed automatically now meets resistance. That friction matters. It signals hesitation inside systems that previously operated without question. Raids, liquidations, and blocked bond efforts don't just weaken finances, they disrupt confidence. And confidence is what keeps an empire functioning when scrutiny intensifies. From the outside, this looks less like collapse and more like compression. The machine still exists, but it's no longer running on momentum. It's running on caution. Every move feels defensive. Every decision is filtered through risk. That's when seasoned analysts know the terrain has changed. The wealth engine hasn't stopped, but it's no longer in control.
In terms of any preliminary seizures, it looks like they haven't actually seized anything yet, even though they executed search warrants and looked for evidence of things. And so a lot of times you'll see listings in there of bank accounts, automobiles, jets, whatever, that the government has already preliminarily seized to make sure it's still going to be available at the time they do a forfeiture hearing. So this one, it's a blank slate. And it's blank enough where if you're the defense attorney and you get to this next phase, which, by the way, is supposed to be with the same jury. They may not know that yet. But that second phase would be one where you really would say to the judge, I don't have any notice here, Your Honor. This is so broadly worded. I need to particularize it, have a chance to digest it, and perhaps bring in expert testimony on both sides about kind of legitimate sources of income versus illegitimate ones.
And you mentioned that, they're also linking his company. So maybe that's his, record studio, or maybe that's, his vodka line. But how does something like a vodka line, how can that potentially even be mixed up with this? How can they say that that's linked to an alleged crime?
Yeah, it's really one of two or maybe even three ways. One is if there's somehow a tie-in where that property, that business was used to facilitate the freak-offs that are in the indictment, for instance, or obstructionist behavior. So if they literally used a record studio for a party and the record studio belonged to one of his companies, you could say that actually facilitated or was an instrumentality to support the criminal conduct. The other way is essentially if it is a proceed, if it was essentially built on money that comes from illegal activity. And then thirdly, and this is where it gets really crazy confusing, so I'll keep it short, sometimes there's something called substitute assets where the government says, okay, we realize that particular asset, that car, that piece of art was not actually bought by proceeds or served to contribute to the crime. But because we can't find enough to satisfy the overall amount we're owed, we're going to take it as a substitute asset. It's a very government-friendly area, this whole idea of federal forfeiture. And again, I think they're in a position where they might have their mitts on almost anything he's ever touched.
And how do they decide just that number that they're looking for? Is there kind of like a flat out number that the government, when charging with these types of cases, that they say, hey, we're looking for 50 million, we're looking for 60 million. How do they decide how much?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, that is an easier task in some circumstances where you have a a fraud situation where you can tell the amount of victimization and say, well, look, it adds up to 2.5 million, and they put that in the forfeiture indictment. They don't have that here. In a drug case, for instance, you might say, well, they were responsible for 10 kilograms of cocaine. A kilogram's about 30,000. So we're looking for 3 million, do the math. Here, it's much more wide open. I think you're looking at an actual trial within a trial if we get to the forfeiture phase, where there's going to be experts saying this is money that's untouched by any sort of criminal enterprise from the defense side, and maybe a forensic auditor from the FBI saying, here's why we're entitled to all these types of proceeds or instruments. So it is a wide open battlefield. It's going to be kind of a textbook example of how deep the government tries to reach for forfeiture if they get to that point.
At what point does that kind of strategy from prosecutors become legally risky for them, though?
That's the thing. I mean, the court of public opinion every now and then turns on forfeiture. And, the idea of forfeiture is that you don't want people to not just get away with crime, but profit from it. Being criminally prosecuted and put in prison doesn't mean that you've lost the assets. And so the idea.
All right, guys, this is the turning point where speculation gives way to structure. From an observer's standpoint, the evidence presented isn't meant to shock, it's meant to connect. Each item, each photograph, each seizure is placed with intention. Prosecutors aren't telling a chaotic story. They're assembling a pattern. And patterns are what courts respect most. What stands out to analysts is the discipline behind the presentation. There's no randomness here. Every piece of evidence supports repetition, continuity, and awareness. The goal isn't outrage. It's inevitability. By showing similar conduct across time, locations, and resources, the case begins to argue something larger than individual behavior. It suggests a system functioning with consistency. From the outside, this is where a personal defense becomes harder to sustain. Isolated explanations lose power when repetition is established. Observers recognize this as the moment the legal narrative tightens. The story stops being about what happened once and becomes about what happened because the structure allowed it to happen again and again.
Things even to hold people accountable, to not let them profit from criminal activity. But over time, you see abuses. You see situations where a person barely had a role in some sort of criminal conspiracy. I mean, literally was on the job for one day and is ordered to forfeit millions of dollars. And that bubbles up to the Supreme Court where they say this is just not totally fair. So there are abuses of the forfeiture system that are seen from time to time. I think, look, if P. Diddy, if Sean Combs is convicted in this case, I don't think he's going to necessarily gin up a ton of sympathy. But there may be legal observers that say, hey, this is a broad, overreaching moment, when they try to collect every single penny that a guy who obviously had legitimate income over long periods of his life.
And for those that do say, hey, isn't this just a financial overreach? How do prosecutors justify that?
Yeah, I think they justify it by saying, in this case, they'll say, look, two things. Number one, we didn't disable him financially pre-trial. We haven't actually locked into his accounts and taken things and frozen things where it might even affect his ability to hire attorneys or hire experts. And secondly, they say, look, it's a criminal enterprise that extended for a number of years that where he had financial profit from this kind of power and control over an enterprise. So I don't expect them to be apologetic. I mean, they may end up showing moments of moderation where they say, well, we're not going to go after this company or that company, but they've left it all on the table for now where they can do a very broad, deeply reaching process if they want to.
And Sean Combs, he's already sold one jet. The Beverly Hills mansion of his is on the market for $61 million or so. Does that seem like someone who is confident that they'll walk, or could that work for or against him in court?
It's probably not going to be anything that's particularly admissible during the trial. It could come up during the forfeiture just to show that, his overall stock has dropped. I mean, I think he's down to his last 400 million. It's a real tough spot to be in. But, but I think at the end of the day, you really can't draw any firm conclusions. He knows he's got a battle of his life going on right now. I mean, this is a life eligible racketeering case. Doesn't mean he'll necessarily get life. It's not a mandatory sentence. But, if the facts are continue to be established of years of abusive and controlling behavior, it paints a pretty dark picture for him in terms of sentencing.
And Sean Combs, he's now brought in Mr. Casella, someone who literally wrote the book on asset forfeiture. What's Casella's role likely to be here?
Well, I worked with Steph at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Maryland for years. He is literally the expert on forfeiture. Whenever I have a situation in private practice where I have a question mark about forfeiture, that poor guy has to take my phone call. So he's a great pick. He knows what he's doing. He knows both the process and the law, which can be a little bit different sometimes. I think he's probably, getting them prepared for the types of challenges. And by the way, I don't know this from him, but I would guess that he's basically figuring out what are the types of challenges we could raise in a forfeiture phase. What are the deficiencies in the government's approach? In other words, are they not discounting lawful employment by Sean Combs? And frankly, some of it could even relate to like how he's spending money right now. When you have a broad forfeiture allegation, it's kind of hard to figure out, are they saying that I can't get attorneys of my choosing because I'm using proceeds of criminal activity? So I think he's probably giving a lot of very sage guidance on how they walk through this process of dealing with a very broad, very potentially deep.
All right, guys, this section explains why the stakes escalate almost overnight. From a third-person analysis, the introduction of RICO fundamentally alters the battlefield. Once RICO enters the conversation, individual moments stop mattering on their own. The focus shifts to systems, networks, and long-term benefit. The case stops asking what happened and starts asking how it was sustained. Observers immediately recognize the implication. Businesses, properties, and revenue streams are no longer neutral assets. They're reframed as instruments. Tools that allegedly enabled protection, continuity, and profit. That framing is powerful because it expands liability beyond actions into infrastructure. It argues intent at scale. From the outside, this isn't about proving a single violation. It's about asserting that the entire operation functioned with purpose. That's why pressure increases so quickly. Once systems are on trial, everything connected becomes vulnerable. Analysts see this as the moment where containment becomes nearly impossible.
Sure.
Since he is so knowledgeable, and since, I don't know if there's anyone who's more knowledgeable than him in this specific department, do you think that bringing him in may challenge the government's playbook at all?
I think it would certainly give them a moment of pause. Look, the reality is there's probably not a ton of time being spent worrying about forfeiture quite yet. They're probably figuring we'll get there when we get there. We got to try to get a conviction. But yeah, it's a shot across the bow. You see Steph Casella lining up on the other side, and you can say this about a lot of different type of expert witnesses and things where you say, wow, that's the king of DNA or the queen of forensic fingerprint recovery. So, I think it's a shot across the bow. They'll realize that they've got somebody that really knows their stuff on the other side, but that doesn't necessarily mean they change their approach in any way at this point.
And there's this idea of facilitating property, that a business or maybe an item helped enable a crime. How direct does that link need to be?
Yeah, we should ask Steph. But yeah, that's a great question. You have to be able to show, a significant link. It can't be just like this 6 steps removed kind of thing. Like there was a bottle of liquor that happened to be on the bar during one of these assaults, and he owns a liquor company, so therefore, the liquor we can presume facilitated the crime. You're going to have some, quantum of proof that's deeper than that. But it's very fact specific, and again, that's why I think you're probably looking. Even though a lot of times forfeiture becomes a very small afterthought to a criminal trial, this one really has the potential to be a completely independent kind of mini trial, delving into his finances, delving into issues just like that, like how well connected can the government make these instrumentalities, these facilitating pieces of property. I think it's inherently pretty difficult, but again, if you use a location, that's a little bit easier. If you say I'm going to use my liquor company headquarters, or I'm going to use a record business studio to have one of these freak-offs, that becomes a much tougher climb for the defense to get out of it as an instrumentality. It's these kind of third time removed ones where they might have some success.
And Like how you said, we're not just talking about past behavior here. Prosecutors say that this was ongoing. Does that make asset recovery just a little bit easier for them?
Yeah, in general, I'd say yes. I mean, because you're talking about a period of years, and you're going to have, during these trials, you're going to have very specific stories from witnesses that say, I was there when X happened at this particular location. But you're probably going to get broad characterizations too. Like he would always, use his liquor to get people drunk before these freak offs. Or there were times where we met and discussed how we were going to do this at office X or home Y, or how planes were used. It might not be a specific moment, but he might have somebody that says, I was at the airport when his private plane brought prostitutes here. So you might not have the precision that you'd have with kind of a single event trial, but you're probably going to have pretty significant stories that, again, tie these properties into the possibility of being forfeited.
How much of a role does public perception play here? I mean, have we seen the DOJ make strategic decisions based on headlines?
Well, overall, sure. We could probably point to all sorts of cases that you could, I think, fairly characterize as a little bit of trophy hunting, where the Department of Justice or even non-federal prosecutors, think this is my great case, and they like the headlines that come with it. But look, I don't think this is an example of a case that's being brought in bad faith. I think it's unusual to see.
All right, guys, this is where the forfeiture strategy unsettles even seasoned observers. Third-party analysts notice immediately how expansive the language becomes. This isn't accidental. It's deliberate. The government isn't targeting isolated assets, it's creating a wide legal perimeter. Anything connected, directly or indirectly, is pulled into question. What's most striking isn't what's named, it's what isn't limited. There's no final number. No ceiling. Just exposure. That uncertainty becomes its own weapon. From the outside, this is where defense strategy visibly shifts. The focus moves away from disproving everything and toward salvaging something. Analysts interpret this phase as psychological pressure layered onto legal force. When everything is potentially at risk, decisions change. Negotiations change. Silence changes. This is where damage control replaces dominance, and separating legitimacy from allegation becomes the central fight.
Person RICO. It's not legally impossible. You can talk about the enterprise as being broader than the individual. And I think tactically, these are pretty smart prosecutors. I think what we should be watching for over the next few weeks are witnesses that come in as cooperating defendants who have pled to RICO conspiracy. I think that's still to come. And even though it's really not supposed to work this way, a jury takes some comfort from that. Like, there's other people that admit that this was a criminal enterprise and that they were part of it. They're actually usually instructed to not draw that conclusion at the expense of, like Sean Combs in this case. But that's a hard thing. You hear 3 or 4 people go, yeah, I was a part of a criminal group. It makes it a little bit easier on some level for them to convict the target of that particular trial.
Well, 2 questions here as a follow-up. When you say, some people may come on the stand and say, yeah, I was a part of that group. Does that count as like a former assistant or some sorts? Because I know one of his former assistants took the stand and said that he set up, he allegedly set up some drugs for Sean Combs in his hotel rooms, or he provided this or he provided that. Does that count? Or are we looking for more of a smoking gun?
Well, what I'm saying is tactically, it's going to be helpful for them to have people that don't just have the inside stories like that, the one you just gave, but that actually say, I'm here under a plea agreement where I've pled guilty to RICO conspiracy. It just sends kind of this emanation to the jury that this is a fairly charged case because these other people have literally put their lives on the line by pleading guilty to it. So again, most of the witnesses that I'm aware of at this point fall into the category of victims or kind of pure witnesses. But I think you're going to see some people that are, maybe more extensively involved, more knowingly involved in some of the terrible things that happen. And they come in and say, I've eaten this plea myself as a condition of my testimony.
Right. And we still have weeks left to go. So I'm sure the government may be bringing this up later on. But going back to the jury, at the end of the day, if Mr. Combs is convicted, who gets the final say on what's seized? Is it the jury? Is it the judge?
Yeah, it's actually the jury. I mean, I've had trials before where the jury, when I was a prosecutor, where the jury would convict, They come out of the jury room to the jury box, and they're holding on to their pocketbooks and their books and their notepads, thinking it's Friday, we're finally going to get to go home. And the judge says, by the way, there's a second part to this trial. And they learn the hard way that the forfeiture actually falls on them. Now, sometimes the forfeiture is kind of self-contained within the guilt innocence. There's not a whole lot to do but argue how much money should be taken from the defendant. But I think this is a case where they're actually going to probably have testimony and stretch their service out a little bit by having this kind of mini trial. Again, they make the decision. Now, sometimes when things have gone badly and you're the defense and you say, we just got convicted of RICO conspiracy, how much do I want this jury to control my life? You can make a run at having a bench trial on forfeiture. You can also try to settle it, but if you want to contest it, you can say, look, Mr. Prosecutor, Mrs. Prosecutor, let's just have the judge handle forfeiture, and they will always agree to that. And then you have kind of a pared down, more legalistic type approach, which is just a judge helping calculate what the forfeiture amount should be and the sources of that forfeiture.
And realistically here, when we're talking about just the assets that could get seized, could Mr. Combs go bankrupt over this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in some ways that feels like the intention of the government when they have something that's so broadly worded. Now, they didn't put a price tag. They didn't say we're looking for $400 million. But, but the import of this forfeiture allegation shouldn't be understated. I mean, he is looking at dire straits if he's convicted, not just in terms of imprisonment, but because they're going to go hard after all these assets.
Yeah, very ironic coming from a rapper that had a song.
All right, guys, this is the chess move that didn't go unnoticed. From an outside view, bringing in a forfeiture expert sends a clear signal. The defense is preparing for life after the verdict. This isn't the move of someone expecting a clean exit. It's the move of someone calculating loss. Observers read this as strategic realism. The goal isn't to deny the storm, it's to redirect its force. Narrow the scope. Challenge the breadth. Protect what can still be legally distinguished from the government's reach. This is about slowing the bleed, not pretending it isn't happening. From the third-person perspective, this signals a transition from confidence to calculation. The defense now operates with acknowledgement of risk. Analysts see this as a disciplined response, but also as confirmation that the financial battlefield may be as consequential as the courtroom itself.
He ruined his life.
Yeah, that was there are a lot of difficult moments in the documentary. I watched all 4 episodes as mentioned, and that was a tough one. And again, information that we hadn't really seen before in prior documentaries. So, this is someone who had co-founded Bad Boy Entertainment with him. A lot of the things he was saying seemed to kind of run along the theme that I think prosecutors were trying to push in the actual case, was that in the prosecutor's view, this is somebody who will do anything to basically get what he wants. He doesn't really care what effects or damage that causes to other people. And it's in different ways, right? Whether it's in the context of alleged abuse, business disputes, alleged sexual assaults, things that have been alleged in the civil lawsuits against him. And I think with Burroughs, it was really, kind of seemed to strike that theme as well, because he's saying, he had forced me out of the stake of my company. He had to deal with things like homelessness, while in the 2000s and 2010s, Diddy was really prospering, music, business, fashion. And one of the things that he had said, what he alleged in the documentary, and again, this is an allegation from him, was that the name Bad Boy Entertainment, Combs's name was not really involved in that on the corporate side. And one of the things he's saying is the reason for that was to avoid having to pay any liability from, the devastating basketball game that had happened in the early 90s, where he was the subject of wrongful death lawsuits because of the multiple deaths that had occurred as a result of that basketball game that Diddy was behind organizing. So that was really, surprising to hear.
Yeah, that was a big allegation, because the families of the victims killed in that stampede. It was horrible. We're talking about December 28th, 1991. Combs, fellow rapper Heavy D, they hosted this charity basketball game. The game took place at the gymnasium of the City College of New York. And according to the New York Daily News, before the basketball game started, people who weren't let inside, they broke a window, swarmed toward the entrance of the gym, all went down a staircase. The doors at the bottom of those stairs opened towards the stairs, not towards the gym. So once a crowd got down there, they couldn't get the doors open and people started being crushed. 9 people died. Dozens of others were injured. And there were no criminal charges that were ever filed against anyone for the stampede, but multiple families and injured victims, they filed lawsuits. And that's just one part, right? So I actually wanted to get into this too. The docuseries devoted a lot of time to the killings of Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls and Combs' alleged connections to this, to both men, obviously knew both of them. So there have been accusations made in the past that Combs' involvement in the East Coast, West Coast rap feud of the 90s, there was more than just talk, that it could have involved things like hit orders. Now, to be clear, these are allegations. There's no evidence to suggest this. This series, though, it emphasizes that he has never been investigated or charged regarding their assassinations. Nevertheless, several interviewees during this documentary expressed that Combs' actions seem suspicious in hindsight. The documentary plays part of an interview that Dwayne Keefe D. Davis did with investigators looking into Tupac's murder, which had become a cold case. And on the tapes, Keefe D. says that Combs agreed to pay him if he killed Tupac and also rival record label head Suge Knight. Now, Davis allegedly admitted that his nephew Orlando Anderson was the one who shot the men, killing Tupac, injuring Knight. But Davis says Combs never came through with any payment. And by the way, Davis is currently awaiting trial for Tupac's murder in Las Vegas. Combs has always denied any involvement in the assassination. That was a big moment, I would say, Elizabeth. That was a big part of this. I didn't know that was going to be a part of this documentary.
I was really surprised as well. So I believe it's the second episode that dedicates a lot of time to it. And like you said, there have been insinuations in the past. They played video clips of, Sean Combs being asked in prior interviews in the 90s and 2000s, do you know, who killed these men? Did you have any involvement? He's always denied it. To be clear, these are just allegations. But yeah, that was really, really shocking. And one of the sort of a little bit more of the backstory behind his alleged involvement.
All right, guys. This is where the case settles into its most unforgiving reality. From an observer's standpoint, the outcome isn't simply prison or freedom, it's preservation versus erasure. Influence depends on resources, and once money stops moving, power evaporates quickly. Assets become liabilities. Access turns into silence. Analysts note how rapidly the atmosphere changes at this stage. What once felt loud becomes quiet. Networks retract. Support becomes conditional. If conviction comes, it won't just determine time served, it will determine what remains. A jury doesn't just judge guilt. It decides survival. That's the ending few anticipate. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual disappearance. Influence fading. Control dissolving. If this breakdown helped you understand the larger picture behind the headlines, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.
Tupac was that a lot of the interviewees in the documentary were saying that Biggie, who was signed with Bad Boy and who was really close with Diddy at the time, was starting to form a friendship with Tupac, and they were getting really close. And a lot of the interviewees were saying, in their view, Diddy didn't really appreciate that. So I think a lot of the themes that you see again is coming up as him sort of wanting and needing to be the number one person in people's lives, whether it was personal, business. And it's really interesting because you see a lot of the themes that, again, the prosecution was trying to push forward that we saw in his personal life with Cassandra Ventura, always needing to be number one, not necessarily regarding the damages he's doing to other people in the prosecution's eyes, right? Playing out in the business sense. So the backstory is that he didn't appreciate the friendship that was forming between Biggie and Tupac, and therefore, that's where his alleged involvement came in. And then when, in terms of the non-payment, I think that was also a really shocking moment as well, because that's something we saw happening over and over in the documentary. Multiple people who were saying, I was cheated out of my share in the company. I wasn't paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And allegedly, that's sort of how he treated the artists that were on his label. So again, it's the theme of always wanting to be number one and, not necessarily giving people their due, business sense or personal sense.
Okay, so with that, I will tell you, I think one of the most shocking allegations comes to Biggie Smalls, okay? You talk about finances, you talk about that, okay. One of the biggest names at Bad Boy, seemingly very close friends with Sean Combs. Well, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs, and again, this is his allegation, according to Kirk Burrows, Combs insisted that Biggie travel to Los Angeles as part of an album tour, and this is despite, the serious dangers that were present from the rivalries, the East Coast, West Coast. And once there, Combs allegedly decided to cancel a trip that Biggie was supposed to take to the UK, instead saying he needed to stay in LA. Combs apparently threw a large party and after which someone opened fire on the car that Biggie was riding in, killing him. Now, Burroughs alleges that Combs used all of this publicity around Biggie's murder and his massive funeral to just gain his own fame for his own benefit, shooting to the top of the charts with the song Missing You, which featured, by the way, Biggie's widow. But this was one salacious claim that I really wasn't expecting. According to Burroughs, Combs, allegedly, charged the costs of that massive funeral to Biggie's estate and had Biggie's recently renegotiated contract changed to make it more favorable for Bad Boy Records and less favorable for Biggie's loved ones after his death. Elizabeth, again, that one I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, it was really unexpected. And again, I think it speaks to the strength of the documentary, just at least creatively and what they were able to get in terms of the interviewees, claims that we hadn't heard before. So the claims were that, he had wanted, in the documentary, the interviews talk about, Diddy had said, we need to put on the biggest funeral New York has ever seen for Biggie. And when apparently, allegedly, when he saw how much it would cost, that's when he had said, we'll be charging this to the estate, allegedly. One of the other things was he had wanted to put out that song about Biggie after he had passed away, and that was really a big moment. He had performed it at the MTV Movie Awards. And then one of the other claims was, Biggie was set to debut on the cover of Rolling Stone, or at least be on the cover of Rolling Stone. And allegedly, one of the interviewees says after he had passed, Sean Combs had called him and said, I'm coming out with my first solo album. I need that cover. So Sean Combs had allegedly taken that cover from Biggie even after he had passed away. And again, it kind of rides to this theme of, in the public, his friend had passed away. He was devastated. But sort of what you see behind the scenes, at least what the documentary is alleging, is all the different ways he's using that to help benefit him financially and in terms of his career, which is something that we hadn't seen before. And, even myself, like I'm sure you empathize, Jesse, as a millennial, we grew up seeing Diddy, knowing the backstory of him and Biggie and sort of knowing that song and thinking, oh, they were close friends. He paid tribute to his friend. That's so moving. And then to hear all of these allegations, it really paints, another picture.
I remember when that happened.
This final layer is what most casual viewers overlook, but analysts don't. From the outside, the silence that follows the major legal moves is just as telling as the moves themselves. When headlines slow down, it doesn't mean the pressure has eased, it means decisions are being made behind closed doors. This is the phase where leverage shifts quietly, not publicly. Observers note that at this point, allies reassess proximity. Business partners review exposure. Institutions begin distancing without announcing it. There's no press release for retreat. It happens through delays, unanswered calls, and revised agreements. What once felt like a wide network suddenly feels narrow and conditional. From a third-person perspective, this is where the true cost becomes visible. Not in court filings, but in access. Influence depends on momentum, and momentum depends on confidence. Once doubt sets in, even untouched assets lose value because no one wants to be last holding the risk. Analysts understand this moment as irreversible gravity. Even without a verdict, the ecosystem changes. Control becomes fragmented. Power decentralizes. And whether the case ends in conviction or negotiation, the structure that once projected certainty never fully reassembles. This is how major cases actually end, not with noise, but with recalibration. And that quiet shift often matters more than the sentence itself. If you want, I can.